Sure, and the one that you forgot was the Michigan Campus Compact, which also dealt with civic engagement in higher education. So I have been very fortunate. I think I was at the right place at the right time. And I'm trying to think of back when we started this. It could have been probably in the 80s, in the sense is when we began the work. For me, I've had an opportunity to really interact with some really great people in the state. And I've had an opportunity also to see people that used to work for me that I work for now. And that's really great to see, the circle, sort of life come full circle for me. But I had one of my great opportunities, really, when you're looking at this particular segment of the population that you want to deal with, is that I got the opportunity to be the first executive director of the Michigan Community Service Commission. And that was done under Governor Engler, when there was a lot of new legislation that had been passed at the federal level, and the Corporation for National Service was formed. And so each state, if they wanted to access those federal dollars, needed to create a state commission. Michigan was a little bit ahead of the time, and we created it right before the legislation was passed, knowing that that was going to be critical for us. And so our governor was, I think, always thought ahead, and his wife was very gracious. And so we were very fortunate to have the First Lady chair the commission. And we were also very strategic about who we placed on the commission at that point. So we had a lot of the great leaders in the philanthropic community. Dottie Johnson, we had interaction with Joel, we had people from business and Terry Pruitt from Dow Cape. So we had a lot of great people that really understood what it was to be engaged civically, and how volunteerism or volunteering in a community really enhances what you do with the money that you have to address community needs. So we were first. We were also very willing to take risk, which I think is really important in this field, and I think is something that I learned in looking at how the Kellogg Foundation took risk all their years in the beginning. And I was always very proud to say that I was a grantee of the Kellogg Foundation, because I always felt that, especially when they were dealing with national organizations that wanted to have a presence or a project, Kellogg always wanted a project in Michigan. We'll give you money, but where's your Michigan touch point? And that for us gave us an opportunity to really interact with some great national organizations in this field specifically. Youth Service America, the Constitutional Rights Foundation in San Francisco, and YLC. There were a number of them that really were all looking at engaging individuals, whether they were in K through 12, higher ed, or as adults in the community. So we were very fortunate to have that. Well, Campus Compact began probably, I'm trying to think, it could have been in the 80s. I'm trying to think nationally. It was a movement that was housed very early on at Brown University, and Susan Stroud was its first national director. And so at that point, it was institutions across the country, whether it was 2 or 4 year institutions, public or private, whose presidents felt a sense of civic duty, and also felt that instilling that civic duty in their students was critical and should be part of higher education. And they also felt a commitment not just to their students, but also to their faculty and their staff, and the relationship that that institution could have with the community where that institution was housed. That was critical. It wasn't for the institution to do research, let's say, on civic engagement and keep it to itself, but how do we interact with the community? How does our research or our work or our teaching impact the community? And also, how can we take our knowledge and learning and skills in our students and try to address those issues in the community? Not issues that we think are important, but issues that the community thinks are important. So how can we mesh that? So when Campus Compact nationally wanted to say, can we do this at a state level? Back then, John Marshall, who was at the Kresge Foundation, I think was involved at the National Campus Compact. And so he said, well, maybe we can do that in Michigan. And so we were very fortunate with his leadership here that he convened a group of individuals. We had John Marshall, we had Dan Poteet from Albion College, he was the provost there. We had Joel Orris, and we had Dr. Mary Lee Davis at MSU. Those were sort of I would call, the backroom guys that kind of was saying, how do we do this here? How do we implement that here? And we were very fortunate, too, that Kellogg felt really strongly about the position, as did Kresge, because Kresge gave us sort of they used one of their own staff members to sort of create the first proposal that went into Kellogg to say, how do we kind of take and match our things, match the institutions, who could be sort of our our inner circle of institutions that are willing to come forward. And so we were very lucky that early on, we had 10 institutions. We had community colleges, we had private institutions, we had four-year institutions, and their presidents were very, very committed to the initiative. So actually what happened in the country was that Michigan, the state of Michigan, California, and Pennsylvania all established Campus Compact within months of each other. Now, we were the most fortunate because we had the Kellogg Foundation funding and support. And we were also probably at that time, because membership into the association required a large financial commitment on part of the institutions. And back then, Michigan's financial commitment from the colleges was fairly high. So we were the highest, plus we had the grant. Pennsylvania based all of its things on what we would call sort of the due structure that they established. And they struggled a bit too. And then California had such a huge system in California, and they also had support, I think it was from the Hewlett Foundation in California. There's a number of them that provided support, and their dues were much less because they had so many institutions to partner with. But we all came together to say that this is something that's very possible. Today, so there was 3 when we started. Today, there's about 40 state compacts around the nation, all supporting the same work. And so I think that laid in Michigan a foundation for us to consider, because it was during the compact years that there was stuff happening in DC talking about, back then it was called the Commission on National and Community Service. What they were doing some what we would call demonstration projects. Michigan was able to reap some rewards from that, taking in some, we did a major expansion in Michigan on the Youth Volunteer Corps model that had come out of Kansas City. And we were able also to fund some other sort of what we would call youth corps, because at that time we had also, probably the year before, had lost all our youth corps in Michigan. We were one of the big states in the early years that really did a lot with youth corps and helping individuals from inner city to kind of take an opportunity and see new ways to get involved in their communities, giving back to their communities, mostly in an environmental setting, but it was really wonderful for those individuals that had that opportunity. So during the time that I was at Campus Compact, the whole legislation passed at the federal level, and the commission was being formed in Michigan. So really, honestly, I was not the first person that was thought about for the position. There was another individual that the First Lady reached out to, and that individual did not. And so then they called me and said, well, do you want to try this? I said, well, I was very frank with her. I said, so who didn't want it to begin with? And she goes, oh, yes. And so she told me who it was, and he was a great guy. We all worked very closely with him too. But at his point in time in his life, he didn't want to necessarily take on. And I said, oh, sure, why not? And so we did it. And so it was really wonderful. We had a lot of flexibility. And we were also very fortunate at the time of starting our state commission that while it was myself and another staff member, the Points of Light Foundation at that time had instituted the Yes Ambassador program. So we were fortunate in Michigan to get 2 young individuals who were assigned to us, funded by the Points of Light Foundation, to give us sort of that, what I would consider sort of a youth voice perspective, which was wonderful, which is what we wanted. And so they did a lot of foundation work for us in getting out the word and talking about what the commission would do and helping us sort of lay the first level of sort of grant writing that we needed done, mini applications to communities to get involved in the process. So they really worked very hard. A couple of those Yes Ambassadors, and Michigan was very fortunate. We had many of them in our state, and some of them, Cynthia Scher was one of the first ambassadors. She went to be one of the vice presidents at the Points of Light Foundation. Now she lives in Australia. Trabian Shorter was another first one, and now, he's with the foundation right now. It might be in the district that I'm not sure, but they all have had great opportunities and have taken leadership roles in the field of nonprofits, which we're all should be very proud of. Well, I was fortunate too that when the opening was advertised in the faculty staff bulletin at Michigan State University, I was heading up the department or the division of women's programs on campus. So I was an MSU employee already. And I had been working there for about 9 years already doing women's programming. We dealt with women, faculty, staff, and students and things like that. But I had also come to the realization back then, at that point, that I needed to leave a field that only saw you either because you were a woman or because you were a minority, because that was the perspective that they wanted you to bring to the field. And so that was all well and good, but I said, there has to be more than me having a woman's voice for this, and not that lobbying for women's issues wasn't critical, it was, but I had done that for 9 years, and I said, well, what do I have to do? Let me put my application in, what could happen? And I was very fortunate, too, that Dr. Mary Lee Davis, who had been working on the Campus Compact piece, had also been an individual that I reported to, because she worked within the vice president of business administration, which is where the working woman on campus was represented by a women's commission there. And so I said, well, okay, I'll try, and I got interviewed. She wasn't the only person. I had, Joel interview me, and Dan Poteet did too. So it was great to see that opportunity, and I thought, I think I could do this. I was always willing to say, I think I could do this. And I know that if I can't, I would be honest with you and say, I really can't. But I think it worked out really well, and we had great support. I think when we went from Campus Compact to the commission was so supportive, and they realized that we would have a number of years where our numbers may not necessarily grow because you needed to establish a foundation. We were very fortunate, too, that with the money from Kellogg, we were able to quickly institute sort of mini grants, what we would call venture grants, to the campuses, so that they could see a return on their investment, so they could get faculty engaged to say, is there something I can do to my class, modify my class to bring more service learning pedagogy to how I teach? Or we could have student groups say, we would love to do this student project. How can we get some small resources to do that? So we were really, those venture grants that we started in the beginning are still going today. So that's a long time when you think it's been over 20 years at the Campus Compact in Michigan, and so has the commission been in Michigan, and has been, I think, very instrumental in bringing, I think, sort of the right people to the table and continuing to nurture those that may have gone but are still connected in their own communities to realize that they were sort of what I would call the front and center people for us in the very beginning. Over the course of time, both Campus Compact and the Volunteer Centers of Michigan, which also has a 20-year history in our state, used to be associated with the Michigan Nonprofit Association. Then we were very fortunate for a short period of time to create the Connect Michigan Alliance, another nonprofit that took pieces of things that were working within the Michigan Nonprofit Association or within the Michigan Community Service Commission, and said, let's put some of these things that, while they still have focus within both M&A and the commission, they might be better off if they were working more collegially or more closer together. And so within the Connect Michigan Alliance, I shouldn't say we merged, we brought affiliates in, which were the Volunteer Centers of Michigan, the Michigan Campus Compact, Michigan's Promise, and the League Michigan, all came into under that rubric, under that umbrella of that new nonprofit that was formed. And also with great support from a wonderful endowment that was really brought forth, because Governor Engler, too, before the end of his term, felt that he wanted to leave a lasting legacy in Michigan, and the Connect Michigan Alliance endowment served that. And it was a public-private. He was willing to put up $10 million of state dollars, which you don't hear of anymore today, and the great community that we have in the philanthropic world in Michigan, both in the sense of foundations and also corporations that have foundations, came forth and said, we will raise $10 million. And so it started out as a $20 million endowment, and so we've been very fortunate that that has continued to support the work that what we're doing right now. But during the course, so we had the Connect Michigan Alliance for about 3 or 4 years, and then with leadership changes, the time came that maybe we should merge the Connect Michigan Alliance with the Michigan Nonprofit Association, that we all were working in the same space. We all shared a suite of offices, which was also been very good, I think, because we have been able to tap the resources and sort of the knowledge from one agency or one affiliate across the spectrum. And so we're very willing to do that. And we've all known each other. I think one of the things that I've always said, and I think I might have mentioned this to you before, is that I think knowing each other and feeling safe with each other and trusting each other in this field cannot be diminished. I think the fact that all the players, whether they were our most eminent Dr. Mobby or Dottie Johnson or the John Marshalls of the world or the Joels or any of the leaders that we've had in our organizations, they really felt that they were there not for their own edification, but for the community, for the work that could really make our state front and center. And I think they all trusted each other. They all believed in each other. And if we stumbled, it was okay, because someone would be there to pick you up and say, you did all right. We're just going to tweak this a little bit. And I think even as a grantee of funders in our state, I don't think I have ever felt that they had a mentality of the I got you. They had the mentality is, you know what? you know, that struggle, that would have happened to me too. This is how I think we can modify that or tweak this, or have you considered this? And it was always in that sort of a learning mode that I think allowed us to nourish and to flourish too as a group of individuals very committed to each other. Well, you know, that's very interesting. I don't think, I think for me personally, I'm in my 60s, so I do think about that. But I do think that we have some individuals in the fields, young people that are coming up the ranks. Carrie Pardo is a perfect example, started as a little kid. I think Kyle is still fairly young. And I also think Paula, as the director of the commission, we have individuals in the field I think will be ready to step up when necessary. I do think that philanthropy is changing. You know, we're talking about the new generation of family foundations and those that are coming up. And I was just reading the Fry Foundation and the 3 new women that are coming. I think that's exciting to see that. I really do think. I think the days where, and I hope I'm not being disrespectful, but the days where foundations were run solely by men is gone. I think the day when the foundations were run solely by men, white men, is gone, because our communities are changing, our state is changing, our nation is changing. And I think we need to be more open to realize that everyone brings something to the table, whether it's a cultural background, a perspective, a personal challenge that you faced in the community or where you've lived that has given you new insights. And sometimes those insights don't just come from people of privilege. They come from other sectors of our community, and we need to be open to that. And I do think we're finding that more and more. And I think young people are always going to be ready to serve. I think people are ready to serve today. We just have to get out of their way. I think sometimes that may be the slight, what I would tend to say might be the slight hesitation on young people saying, I'm ready right now. I think we need to be willing to step up and step aside and to allow new thinking to come in. I think they are very entrepreneurial now, while we might not have been so much in the past. But I think that's good. I think communities and our nonprofits need to be thinking a lot more entrepreneurial, not to the extent that profit is what rules how you do, but in the sense of saying, how can I do both good for the community and maintain my nonprofit existence? Or if I'm a company, how can I make a profit and be a corporate citizen of where my community and where my company sits? I think that is crucial to us moving in this state specifically and in this nation forward. We have so much history that I think sometimes we lose sight of our history. And we need to go back to realize that we did a lot of things first. I'm very proud to say that I was in Michigan when we did things first. But we need to step back and say, what's happened to being first? We need to move again to be first. I think maybe this particular project that you have will help us reconnect again. And sometimes we lose sight of things that we really shouldn't. And I think that is what I'm hoping will happen. We have new people in our staff at M&A, young people coming up front and center that I want them to be able to take the helm and the reins of this in the future and carry it to a new level. Michigan has been very fortunate in its history, I think because of the support that we've had from Philanthropy, our philanthropy partners in the state, but also in the sense that we've had individuals that are willing to take that little edge, look over that cliff and say, it's okay, I'll find, that step will be there when I jump. And so we have done a number of things that I think many other states would just have been very envious of us. Our relationship, meaning the nonprofit world's relationship with philanthropy in Michigan, is very unique. The relationship that higher education has with nonprofits in Michigan is very unique. I think we've been blessed with great leaders all around. And I think they have been, one of the things that I really espouse is that I think we have been blessed with people that are servant leaders, first and foremost. They are not autocratic leaders per se. They are not leaders for the sake of saying that I have a title or a position, but they have been leaders that say that I will lead because I have a purpose to support, and that I'm here to not lead but also to serve my staff, to serve the organization, to serve the board, and to serve the community, irregardless of who you've been or where you've been. That's, I think, is really, Michigan really can exemplify the servant leader that I think we have promoted and have seen in some of our great leaders. Dr. Mobby, for me, is that perfect example of someone who never would make you feel uncomfortable. knowing that he headed up such a major international foundation. You could walk into a room and he would always be gracious to everyone, kind of a thing. And so that for me is a sign that this is what we need to do and to continue to instill in the work that we do and in the young people that we're bringing up, whether it's through the League Michigan, in schools, getting them engaged in their communities, giving them the voice because they know what they want to do and not saying we know because we're the adult in the room. And I think that kind of work is really critical to us moving forward. Probably about 2 years into our forming our state commission here, because we did, as I said earlier, we started ahead of time. So probably about 2.5 years in is when President Clinton came into being, not into being, but came into his position as president. And we also then passed the legislation that formed the Corporation for National Service as the new federal agency that would merge both what had been called Action in the past, which oversaw VISTA and all our senior corps programs, inside this new organization, which we had hoped for. Let me say that in quotes. We had hoped would be less bureaucratic than what federal government would be. And so at that point in time, I was asked if I would leave the Michigan Community Service Commission and come to DC to head up a subunit within the corporation, which was the unit that would give out all the money to state commissions and national nonprofits. So when I was there, we had a pool of about $426 million that we subgranted to state commissions as an entity by which we would do this. And during that first year, we were also helping states establish their commissions. We had one here, but many of them didn't exactly know what to do. And we also were dealing with national nonprofits, sort of like a city year was considered a national nonprofit, or Teach for America, or Youth Build with Dorothy Stoneman. Those were all national nonprofits who also wanted to have entree into the AmeriCorps funding, which was coming through this new piece of legislation. So I spent 4.5 years there. They were exciting years for me. I was very fortunate that my husband stayed here with my children in Michigan, so they had a strong, firm foundation here. And it was exciting to see states move to a new level of engagement. I think it was important for us to realize that even from the very beginning, and it's been over 20 years now when you think about it, that even from the very beginning, I got there in March, and already in May, the Congress was thinking about throwing the agency out with the bathwater. And so it's been an ongoing process every 4 years or every 8 years as things have changed. To see the struggle that really, and we have really small pots of money when you look at the bigger picture, but it has been the only pot of money at the national level that looks at the fact that citizen service or service learning in K through 12 schools can have such a long-lasting impact. When you have an AmeriCorps member that generates 10 additional volunteers by their work in a community, and you multiply that by the number of AmeriCorps members that we can have in the country, can you imagine that power? And we're dealing with small pots of money. We're not dealing with, a $10 million gift that we're giving out, Most of the grants, while there might be one or two that might be high, maybe $1 million or so for national nonprofits, many of them are $250,000, which in many cases that could mean a lot of money to some people, but not when you're trying to establish a core of individuals committed to a community's needs, whether they're in literacy or in homelessness or in housing. Habitat for Humanity is another big example for us too. But it's also in giving them an opportunity to say, you know what, I can dedicate a year of my life. I don't have to worry. Even though, remember, a stipend is minimal. It's about $11,000. It's not, nobody's making $20,000 a year here. But they're given the opportunity on equal footing. So it's not just the very wealthy that can say, I can take a year off from school if I want to, or I don't need to go to work right now because I can be supported by my parents. But you can take an individual that maybe doesn't have those luxuries at home and say, I can also give back to my community. And so I think we have found that national service has been a tool that can really invigorate, it can empower, and it can really bring about change in community when we have strong nonprofit partners in the field that are dedicated to that work and realizing that dedicated time by individuals that give of their time, talent, and treasure to a community will make a big difference. And we're seeing this not just in Michigan, we're seeing this across the country, where programs have had major impacts. And I think sometimes, I may be again disrespectful here, but I think it's time that people need to put aside their political sort of viewpoints and say what is best for our communities. And we know that Times are tight. We understand that. And we know that the economy is not good. But sometimes we need to realize that a $10,000 investment is much better spent now than a $30,000 investment 10 or 15 years in the future, because we haven't engaged young people the way we should right now. And so they have chosen a path of not giving back. They've chosen a different path. And I think people need to wake up. I don't understand how we can change that. I think there's always been that turmoil in the Beltway, in the district, as people would say. And I think people would really, I think when our legislators really listen back in their communities where we have national service programs, they do get the message, but they have to listen. I think that's one of the biggest things I think that we're suffering in our country today. People don't really listen. People talk, but people don't give the time to listen to what the people are saying. And I think that's really is going to be sort of one of our biggest challenges as we move forward. I think for us is the fact that we had done so many first. We were very willing. I think all our different streams in Michigan always collaborated. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Really, we're truly collaborative, meaning we come to the table, I'm going to give you something, you're going to give up something, I'm going to give up something because this is what we want at the end. And I think at the national level, we've always had national voice at that table from Michigan. There hasn't been a board of the corporation that hasn't had Michigan representation on it. And we have been fortunate too that we have brought staff from Michigan into the corporation. I wasn't the only one. We had people that worked in NCCC, we had people that worked in training and development, we had people all across the spectrum. So there was that sort of Michigan feel, I hate to say it, Michigan feel that we really were doing it. And we also had people from Michigan that worked with other national organizations. I have a nice friend and a colleague of mine. While she was an adopted child and grew up in Maryland, she went to U of M, and she was Jennifer Bastris, and she went to work for Youth Build for many, many, many years. She's actually back at the corporation now as one of the deputy directors for AmeriCorps. But it was the issue of understanding how we worked, understanding that there is a give and take in how we move forward. And that sometimes you might be in a setting where you do get angry with each other, but that's okay. Because sometimes when you get angry, you step back and you listen a little bit harder to get that point across. So you try a little harder to get your point across. So I think from our perspective, we have been very fortunate. We've had great individuals like Sam and Kyle who have really been attuned to policy. How do you talk about policy? And sometimes I think the work in the policy arena can be sort of overcome with jargon. And I think people need to have that jargon sort of diffused and really in plain language tell me what's the issue here. How do we say or position our position really moving forward so that, you know, Mary and Diana can understand it and we don't have to have a degree in policy to understand what we're doing. And I think that partnership that you talked about earlier between CMF and M&A has been really a lot around the policy issues. How do we talk about policy that impact nonprofits? How do we talk about policy that impacts charitable giving? And how we know that both of them really do come together and they do mesh and they need to support each other. And we also need to be willing to step back and say our voices is an important voice. It is not necessarily a political voice. It is a voice of reason, I would tend to say, in all the hub, because a lot of the policy questions that come up impact human services. And we have really supported the work that Human Service Agency do. Foundations and philanthropy have always been really the backbone of how many of our community issues are being helped and supported by that work. And so it is human service areas when you look at needs that people have. And so I think it's really critical for us to realize that we have been very fortunate, that we've had great leaders. Even going back to Governor Romney, you know, he was on the board of the first Commission on National and Community Service. And so he gave us a voice. He was a firm believer that, excuse the expression, we should have a volunteer center in every post office. We don't need post office help. Volunteer centers can deliver the mail. But he was very committed to that thing, that while he realized that money was critical, he also realized that money alone wasn't going to solve the issues in our community. He was truly ingrained in the feeling that people is what multiplied the money. It wasn't just money. so that if I could give you 10 volunteers and you had $20, you could probably do a lot more with those $20 and the 10 people than if I gave you just $20, kind of a thing, because he felt truly in the belief that that multiplying effect was really critical. And so for him, he's another great leader that we had that was at the national level, that was at front and center too on the Points of Light Foundation, would help also to nourish and really expand the volunteer center network around the country. And Michigan has been very fortunate that while we have many volunteer centers in our state, they're not in huge cities. They're sometimes in local communities, making us realize that local communities have a way to impact also, and that we should be just as proud of the work that they do, whether the community is a small community, that we are in what happens here in Grand Rapids with a big community population, because the issues, human needs are fairly about the same, no matter whether you're in a rural community or in an urban area. And so we wanted to make sure that volunteering was really critical to how that community operated, and not for us to come across and say, we have the blueprint for your success. The success was really built within the community structure that they had.
I was going to ask you about Governor Romney, because he pretty much bullied us into
He did, you know he did, but so, it was important.
Yeah, tell me what he did. He was retired as governor at that
Yes,
point,
he
right?
was.
So outside of Michigan,
Yes,
he was a citizen, right?
Yes, and I think he helped, because he was very instrumental too, like when Michelle took over as the chair of the commission when she entered. And he was, I think, a great sounding board for her too, you know, behind the scenes. And Eleanor, his wife, his gracious wife, was always with him. And I think they actually, when you think about it, they lived that life. They lived the life of service, similar to what I would call a Dr. Mommy does. They lived that life all the time, and they had both at the national level and at the state level, and I think in their own communities, they lived that life. And I think that was critical for us, because you and I remember, we did one campaign and we're saying, oh, I don't know if this is gonna, he says, it'll work. And I think sometimes I really do wish you were here, because I think he would prod us a little bit more, you know? And I think sometimes we can become complacent. I think sometimes we do feel, okay, we're here and we've made it. And no, I think we always need to have that one little person in the back of our mind, or physically next to us, sort of nudging us and saying, no, you gotta try harder. And you know what, you're not asking the right questions. Let me tell you the question in the ear and you ask the question, because I think that's how he was. I think he felt that way too in his roles, both at the Commission on National and Community Service, and then when he went from there to serve on the Points of Light Board too. He felt really important about that work, and I think that was critical for our success here in Michigan too. Well, you know, I think it's a good question. I think it's a question that people could ask Kyle too when you look at M&A. Since we are a membership organization, all we can do is bring, what I would tend to say is to bring best practices to the field and hope that it sinks in. I do think that in the most recent years, I think our centers are feeling economic concerns more and more. I think we're also seeing, not just in Michigan, but in Michigan, let me step back. In Michigan, more than half of our centers have always been part of the United Way family, and we're excited about that. We've never decided that it had to be either or. For us in Michigan, we felt that whatever the community felt was the best way, that was the best way to deliver the service. But I do think nationally the struggle exists now more and more, that where we might have had a 501c3 independent volunteer center, that they're not able to sustain themselves any longer. I think the funding isn't there, or I would always, you know, bicker with that, because I think a community should have the money. And we're not talking about a 7 or a 10-person staff, but we're talking about a commitment. Strongly, I believe that United Way should be funding volunteer center activities, irregardless of whether it's a 501c3 in the community or within their own sort of cadre of programming that they do. I also believe that a community foundation should realize that that is one of their, should be one of their commitments to give back to the community, that their endowments, their money should also support the re-engagement of community citizens into doing more with less. And so I think those are two great sort of what I would call funding streams in a community, that we should not say, oh, it's their problem, or no, it's not my problem, it's your problem. Because I think engaging community members is really critical. And while we have many nonprofits and communities that have strong, what I would call volunteer generation sort of activities, because they have the name, Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Girl Scouts, even Habitat for Humanity, to mention a few. There are many that don't have that voice or don't have that internal sort of infrastructure that I think a volunteer center comes in to help them. We don't try to do it for them, but we do try to help them realize what are the best steps for you to get to where you want to be. And I think a community needs what I would call sort of maybe an unaffiliated voice, a free voice that says we all need to come together to address this particular issue. And we're going to generate sort of that enthusiasm in that campaign for giving back to your community by your time. We also want your talents and your money, but we know that if we get your time, your money and your talents will come later. We want your talents too with the time. It's not that I'm saying that they're separate, but we all know from studies that if you give to an organization because you volunteer to an organization, you feel more strongly about their mission and their impact, and then you're willing to take out your wallet and say, you know what? I'll give you my time, but I'm going to give you some resources because we know resources are critical to bringing that organization to the next level. And so I think, for me, what I would like for my volunteer centers is to realize that their voice has to be for all of the organizations in the community, not just for some. I also think it's important for them to keep on the forefront in their communities the fact that volunteers do make an impact, and that they also need to be able to articulate quite often that people feel that volunteers are free. Yes, I do give my time to my agency freely, but you need an infrastructure behind me coming in so that I know that I'm being well used, that I'm getting training, that you're working with the nonprofit to connect me to make sure. So we need to realize that while volunteers, to some people, are free, hell, we have them in the drawer. Let's just pop them out of those little sponges. You put them in some water and they pop up like a little volunteer. That's how some people really think things happen, but they don't. You need to have an infrastructure. You need to build relationship with nonprofits who will turn to you and say, you know what, we've been trying to recruit volunteers for this, but it's not happening. So how can you work with us to kind of get a campaign or help us develop a campaign? That's what I hope for our centers. And I hope for our communities to realize that while you may not have a storefront center, but you need to bring your volunteer coordinators together and talk about what our issues, or talk about that, you know what, a volunteer in a community is a volunteer to the community. They may give the time right now to Habitat for Humanity or to Big Brothers Big Sisters, but when the agency begins to think that you belong to them, then the agency has lost sight about what a volunteer does, or what a volunteer is, and what their work in the community is all about. We should be willing to share our volunteers. We should be willing to recognize our volunteers regardless of which organization they're supporting, because I may early in life be very willing to support Habitat for Humanity in my early years, but I may change later on to maybe Big Brothers Big Sister. That doesn't make me any less a volunteer, and I would hope that all organizations in the community that I have volunteer for would sort of court me in a sense to thank me for my time. It's not because I want accolades. I don't think that's what people are looking for. People are looking for sort of a sense of respect because I gave you of my time and I've helped the organization move to the next level. Or I've helped you during a period where you wanted to do a fundraiser and no one else would help you, and I've come to your aid at that point. And that means for everyone in the community, not those that have money, but people that have time and are really committed to the issue. Those are the ones that I want to see engaged on an ongoing basis. Yeah, I know. It's been hard to sell that. I think, I shouldn't say it's been hard. I think states have been very envious of us for the last 15 years, I would tend to say, about what we've been able to do here. And I think while we have tried to sort of lay a roadmap for them saying these are the critical partners you need to bring to the table, whether it's your foundation community like we've done here through first Dottie and then through Rob, or whether it's to say colleges can really come to your aid if you reach out to them. Or you know what, there's a wealth of giving in your K through 12 students. Don't dismiss them because they're young. They have a lot to do. They can do a lot of things. But I do think that, as I mentioned early on today, is that I think that the friendships, let me say truly, that the friendships and the bonds that created that I don't want to call it an inner circle in the sense of exclusivity, but in that realm of individuals 20 years ago that were working in the field, that it really has helped us sort of go to the next level. I think we've been willing to switch jobs, jump from this job to this job. You were my boss, now I'm your, no big deal. We're all here because of what we want to get to the next level. I think you will see that time and time again, that we have been very fortunate to do that. And we have been fortunate enough to have those individuals stick around. I think that's the other thing that we sometimes may lose sight in Michigan, that those leaders, many of those, the majority of those leaders are still here, and they still communicate, and they still get together, and their vision is still, I think, always evolving. I think that's what's exciting for us. I think it's always evolving. And so the work that we've done with our community foundations is really critical. And while there are community foundations elsewhere in the country, we know that, not to the level, I think, or cohesiveness that our Council of Michigan Foundation has been able to do with them. The young people that we sort of, I would tend to say, encouraged our community foundations in the early years to think about developing the YACs, the Youth Advisory Councils or committees, depending on how they were in their communities, really has formed a group of individuals today that you would be so proud of. I think it would be great to have an alumni reunion of all the young people that participated, where they did it even for a year at their local community foundation. They are, I'm sure, doing great leadership things right now. So I think we were fortunate. We had great thinkers. I think we had great visionaries that we were all able to, and I'm not one of those. Those are other people like the Russ Mobbies and the Dottie Johnsons and the Robs. And Sam and Kyle, I think, have always been very visionary to see the next level up, or to say, you know, it is possible. We can have a task force, but it's possible. We'll do it anyway, kind of a thing. I think that kind of work, I think, is what has put us, I think, ahead of other states. While other states may have a lot of other foundations and a lot of other money or higher education institutions, I think we have been truly grounded in realizing that this group of colleagues knows how to work together. And there are times that we push at each other, and there are times that we may not always be happy with each other. But I think our vision is larger than our individual. People may say, I don't necessarily see a lot of individual ego in the group of the people that I've had the pleasure to work with over these past 20 years here in Michigan. And that I've always been so proud to say, you don't always want to go and to say this is how we did it in Michigan, but you're always willing to say, you know, I think you should talk to this group of individuals in your state, similar to what we did in Michigan, because I think it may open the communications or the doors to taking that next step. And I think that was something that we tried really hard when we envisioned the Connect Michigan Alliance, is how do all these partners that have supported works in different, people may say different silos, how do we come together to say, how do we work better, more collegially, more collaboratively? And sometimes we know that collaboration isn't going to be simple, and we also know that not every project lends itself to true collaboration. Sometimes you have to say, have to step away from the table and say, it's not going to work. But the communication has started, and so it may be something that can happen a number of years down the road. Collaboration takes time to accomplish. It doesn't come overnight. So as we talked about before, at the time that that Governor Engler was about to leave, and he came up with the idea about establishing an endowment. We didn't know what we would call it. They called it at the end the Connect Michigan Alliance. But it was a way to say, how can we develop an infrastructure of funding that can support the volunteer infrastructure in our state? And so at that time, when that conversation was happening, Kyle was the head of the Michigan Community Service Commission, and Sam was at the head of the Michigan Nonprofit Association. And while Sam was there, both the Volunteer Centers of Michigan and Michigan Campus Compact were housed within that organization. And so the leaders of those two respective agencies, it was Amy Smitter toward the end, who was at Campus Compact, and for the Volunteer Centers of Michigan, it was Judy Timowitz. And so they all came to the tables to say they all helped fundraise in their own specific ways. There was a great leadership team brought together to see how we could raise the money, and people took time from their organizations. So Kyle and Sam took time from running their individual organizations, or did it above and beyond what they were doing all the time, to say, how can we think about creating a new entity? And as I said earlier, each one looked at, what is it within my agency that might better sit here? than as opposed to sitting within my agency now. Because sometimes programs come to agencies just because you're the agency that makes the most sense at the time that the program is being developed. And so I think that's what we were trying to do, is to say who should be part of that. And both Campus Compact at that time and the Volunteer Centers of Michigan, and from the commission perspective, Michigan's Promise at that time, seemed all to be perfect things that each of the entities could give up. They still would be supporting their various streams, but this would allow a more cohesive work about how these organizations happened. And so they came together, and we were also very fortunate that they were very smart. The guys were smart to say, we're going to create a board that represents all the partners. So it isn't just a brand new board. It's a board that brings with it history and sort of a point of view of the original sort of signers of this little declaration that we have here. And so I think that gave power, I think, and perspective to that board to realize what it was doing and what it would try to do. And so during the first year or so is when another group outside said, well, we're interested in the League, and that was the Learning to Give and how we bring that, and that's how the League Michigan came to be part of the Connect Michigan Alliance. So about 2 years, maybe about 3 years, and I'm trying to think, Sam, who had been at the head of the Michigan Nonprofit Association now for 10 years, decided, oh, isn't it great to be young and that I want to take off a year and a half and travel the world? And I'm saying, oh, yes, take me with you. I can carry your luggage, kind of a thing. But he was at a point in time, I think, that he wanted to step away. He felt that he had done, I think, 10 years is a long time to head an organization that had really been very young when he had taken over. And so I think his ability to think about that, and I think his friendship with Kyle allowed them to think strategically, and the boards. I think there were people on the boards, too, that had a willingness to listen to their sort of proposition, that maybe the time was right to bring the Connect Michigan Alliance and the work that they were doing, because there were still things that they were doing that almost seemed to be the same thing. There was public policy that both did, and so shouldn't the public policy be all in one place? Or the support of volunteer engagement, because that was part of the mission that M&A had at one time, and actually they had taken it out of their mission statement when the Connect Michigan Alliance was formed so that people wouldn't sort of confuse things. But I think they had a time to think about it. They were willing to say, I think this could work. And so another task force we love task forces in Michigan. We created another task force composed of their leadership and also respective members of the boards. And at that time, there were people from the Community Service Commission board and also the M&A board to say, and the M&A board at that, and also the Connect Michigan Alliance board too, because there were 3 of them, to say, how do we think about this? And so they did a study, they worked with each other, and it was felt that the time was probably right. Sam was thinking about stepping aside, and it would open the opportunity to maybe say that the 2 agencies could come together, that maybe the pre-existing president of one could remain as the new president of the new merged agency, and how we would bring this forward. And so it did. It took about a year. It wasn't done overnight. It took about a year and a half. And then Sam was able to go traipse off around the world. And it was great because he did service. That was so critical. He did service on every continent that he went to. And he talked about engagement, and he talked about, I think, the civic mission of individuals and what we in Michigan and also in the United States really felt very close, that many countries do. They just don't use the same words that we use here to describe it. So I think it was really a wonderful opportunity for him, and for us it was a wonderful opportunity that Kyle was able to stay at the head of the organization and for us to come back together as one. The stories for me really revolve around the people, about the people and the individuals. And it's not just one story. I think it's how people have impacted sort of the work that I've done. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay. For me, probably one of the first individuals that I met in the work was Pete Ellis. And he was my program officer when the Campus Compact got its grant from the Kellogg Foundation. And he was a fairly big person, sort of overpowering. And I was a little person. I'm short, a little person like that. And so it was really interesting to listen to him talk to me back then about what it meant to be a program officer and what my role would be with him. And that I think, and we didn't spend a lot of time together because unfortunately he passed, but in the few times that I met with him, I always realized then that he was on my side. that there was nothing wrong that I could do wrong that would be bad, that it would all be a learning moment. You know, those teachable moments, he would say, you can learn from anything, no matter how bad it is. And I think he taught me that just by his presence and his support of the work that I was trying to do, because we were just starting Campus Compact here. So I think from that perspective, I think he taught me the fact that you will fail, and that's okay. And I think the fact that a major foundation had a program officer who said, it's okay if you fail. It's not going to be a personal failure. It is a failure because we didn't think about things the right way. And so from Pete, I went to Joel, who was also very caring, and it was great. But I also felt, too, that the individuals at that point that I interacted with early on at Kellogg were always the type of program officers I felt that never had what I would consider the I got you mentality. It was always the mentality is that we're here to help you succeed. So what is it that you don't get that I can get you resources or someone more experienced than you to help you think out that process? And so for me, those were great mentors to teach me to realize that how my role should be, whether I was working with higher ed institutions or later on as I worked with grantees in the work that I did either at the commission or at the corporation, is that you should be there to help the people that you give some resources to do better. So I think that is important for me. I also think that I found in some of the leaders that I had an opportunity to work with early on that if I screwed up, they would be willing to step in for me. Perfect example is the very first Campus Compact conference that I had. We had invited Kathleen Kennedy Townsend to be our speaker. We had mailed her the ticket. We had done everything. We had called ahead of time. And so I'm looking at my clock, and it's like 4 o'clock, and she's supposed to speak like at 6. And this woman was nowhere to be found. And I said, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? So I finally got on the phone, and I called, and I said, Miss Townsend. She goes, hello. And I said, Miss Townsend, where are you? And she goes, I'm in Massachusetts. I said, Miss Townsend, you're supposed to be here in Michigan. What happened? She goes, no, you have it all wrong. That's like a couple of weeks from now. And I'm saying, oh, no, it's like this minute. And so she apologized. I hung up, and I said to myself, okay, what am I going to do? This is the keynote speaker that I had. So back then, Jackie Taylor, who was the executive assistant to Dr. Gannett at LCC and was one of our member schools. No, I'm sorry. She was a special assistant, but it wasn't Dr. Gannett. It was Dr. Sykes was the president then. And she goes to me, oh, don't worry. I'll get the president to speak. She says, I'll run back to the office. I'll put out one of his commencement speeches. He did one recently about service. It'll be perfect. I'll just tweak it here, and there. And so these two individuals, who while I might have been working them with, they didn't have to come to my rescue. It was like he was meant to speak that night no matter what happened. And so those are the little things that I have found in the little stories that I see in my life, that people have always been there in this state to help me and the work that I'm trying to pursue, or to help the bigger work, and that I've been able to learn from them. I think that's been the case with everyone I've worked with. They have been giving and gracious. They have tested me. I know that John Marshall used to love to test me all the time. That was one of his styles. But I got used to that. It was okay for him to ask a lot of questions. And Dottie Johnson likes to ask a lot of questions too. And when you think you have the answer, she asks you one more question. It's not the answer that you thought you were going to give. So I think it's that prodding and that learning from that sort of interaction with each other that I think has been very helpful to me. The only funny thing that I can remember, it didn't happen to me, but it was when Dottie Johnson was sort of graduating from her position, and then the 3 guys decided to dress up as girls. So we had Dave Egner, we had Sam Singh, and I think it was Kyle, and they all did a little dance across the stage. So that to me was very funny to see sort of what I would consider, and everybody did too in the room, consider as really strong, outspoken, well in command, sort of dressing up with wigs and dancing, but because I think they felt in many cases that she had mentored all of them at different points in their lives, and I think, and had given them enough sense of who they were, that moment of slight embarrassment was not something that would diminish who they were and what they tried to do for the field and the work that we did. And so I think those are sort of the funny stories that I can think of, but I think more than anything, it's not so much fun that I would say about the interactions that I've had with the people in the field, but I think about their care and their dedication to them, to the work that they have really believed their whole life that they had been engaged with. And I think to this day, whenever I see Dr. Mobby, and we can hug and kiss, and it's great to see a man of that stature and that history be willing to still remember everyone that he interacts with and be so gracious about that. I would hope that if we can all leave this world, like taking that from him, I think we will have won a great treasure, I think personally, each one of us. I was born and raised in New York City, in Manhattan. I lived in Washington Heights all my life, probably the first 21 years there. And my mother was a seamstress. So my mother was the head of household. She was the sole breadwinner. And I also came from a family of 3 children, but I was the baby. And we were all 10 and 19 years apart. So my sister was 19 years older than I was, and my brother was 10 years older than I was. So we were like really 3 separate families. By the time I was 3, my sister had been married and moved back to Puerto Rico, which is where my parents were born and lived. And so for me, I came to Michigan by a fluke, really. You know, I was never, I had friends and relatives here, and they had come. Their kids had come to do a spring break in New York, and so they talked about, why don't you come to Michigan and go to Michigan State? Well, at that time, I was like in my junior year of college, and I said, oh, well, let me see. And so I came up for a visit. And for me, coming from New York City and coming to Lansing, which may be considered a big city to a little city, but the fact that I could look around the city and not see tall skyscrapers was amazing to me at that time, and this was in the early 70s, or that people would park their cars and not lock them, or that there was a lot of green grass. And even though I noticed that there was poverty in this community, it is different when poverty is a house next to another. I grew up in a tenement, literally, so that poverty was around you, above you, below you, because that's how you lived in a high-rise kind of a thing. And so for me, poverty in Lansing was very different. It was almost like if you wanted to be poor, this would be the best place to be poor. And it sounds silly, but from my perspective at that time, it was amazing. And so I was very fortunate that I applied as a transfer student, and I came to Michigan State. So I left my mother and father, and of course, my sister and their husband were thinking about coming to Michigan because Puerto Rican girls are just not let to go unless you were married. So luckily, my sister was coming to Michigan, and so I was allowed to come up. And so it was really great. I had studied, my undergraduate work was in industrial psychology because I wanted to be an efficiency expert. I don't know why. So I finished my degree here at MSU. And I was very fortunate that when I did my year of study here, I was able to get a position as a work-study student. It was wonderful. And I got a work-study student with Model Cities of all kind of programs, a very community-based, oriented federal program that looked at giving grants to the community or nonprofits or even creating some of them to address community issues. So I worked there for about a year as a work-study student. I graduated MSU, and they had another wonderful federal program at Model Cities called CETA, which was like an employment program. So here I was graduating college back then. To earn $12,000 a year was hot money. I was great with an undergraduate degree. I would hate for students to think about that was making it today. So I was able to stay on as an employee, and I worked at that point in time. The Model Cities program in Lansing had just received a major federal grant, transportation grant. So we were trying out propane and electric buses in our community. Some of them, and we were also trying to see is how we could take sort of smaller neighborhoods and combine sort of these feeder buses to bring them into the main bus line so that people could really get around the city. And also using propane and electric buses, look at the environmental impacts. And so I worked with the project to kind of kick it off there. And after a while, I really enjoyed it. It might be silly, but we used to ride, sometimes people would say, these buses just go around in circles. And they were missing the point that, yes, it was a circle in a neighborhood because we were trying to get you from different points to a main feeder line for the regular transportation system in the city. A lot of people didn't get it. So I spent a couple of years doing that, and then I stayed on with Model Cities. I worked for the city for 9 years. So I worked as what you would consider today probably a program officer with a portfolio of federally funded sub-programs that we funded. And then I also moved into the division on evaluation, so we were looking at the success and the impacts that the programs that we funded had. And so I was doing that for 9 years when we were able to get a small grant from the state to establish a women's bureau in Lansing. And so Jacqueline Warren, which was the head of the Model Cities program in Lansing, said, do you want to start this? You want to work on this? And so I did. And so we did that program for about 3 years. I stayed with it for about a year and a half. And we did a lot of work at that point in time in history in our country. There was a lot of legislation about displaced homemakers. So those were individuals that had been in marriages for many, many years, and now were finding themselves divorced and really had never spent any time really working in the world of work, but had done a lot of volunteer and community organizing in their own right. And we were helping them take those skills and put it in a resume so that they can present themselves to a potential employer. So we were really excited about the work that we did then. And so from the Women's Bureau, I ended up seeing another ad in the paper. God, these articles. And it was to be the director of women's programs at MSU. And so I applied, and I was sort of taken back that I was selected. And I spent 9 years doing women's programming at Michigan State University until Campus Compact, and then the commission, and then the corporation. And so that's sort of been my track. So really, I did an undergraduate in industrial psychology. I worked on a master's, and I got my master's in labor and industrial relations and employee relations. And I never did a day's work in either of those fields. But I do think that I met great faculty members at MSU that kind of made me think about sort of, and you deal with, in labor, you see the work of unions and the impact that they've had on the work and the worker in our state, especially Michigan has always been a strong union state. But I also, it gave me an appreciation too, working in model cities and stuff like that, of the fact that local communities have a voice, and that voice is critical to addressing what they really want in their communities. And so for me, it opened up a way to say, you know what, we need to listen more, as I said earlier. And how do we take what they're saying and their dreams and try to bring it to some level of fruition, however you can do that.
Did you ever dream that this would be your career path?
No, never.
Yeah.
No. I actually wanted to be a lawyer. Yeah. I would encourage them to take as many opportunities or many, I don't want to say chances because that's not exactly the word, but to open themselves up to a lot of no, that's not the word either. I'm sorry. Let me make sure that I have the right word. I want them to be willing to take chances. I think that's one of the things that I was very willing to do all my life. And I don't necessarily come from a background with a mother who took chances. She believed that you worked one job all your life, kind of a thing. And so for me, I was never afraid to take a chance. But I was also an individual that was willing to say, you know what, I don't know that. I need to read more about that, or I need to talk to some more people about that before I say I think I know that. And so I think I would encourage young people to say that you should be very proud to say, I don't know. I think we have a society right now that no one wants to say they don't know. They're willing to say they know everything, and they really don't. Or they're willing sometimes to sort of disparage those that have been before them that have many years of experience because they know it better. We have a better way to do that. And nothing wrong with having new ways to do things. I think that's what makes everything so exciting. But I do think that they need to take time to understand sort of the historical perspective. I think people who don't understand our history and don't understand sort of who the key leaders in our state were to move us to where we are today will miss a lot. I think all our young people should strive first and foremost to be a servant first and a leader second in whatever work they do, regardless of where you are. I think you need to serve others. And I think for me, that is critical. And to be willing to learn more every day. You should never think that you've learned all you can learn because you have so many degrees or because you've worked so much. I think that's important. Surround themselves with books, I think is important. Read all you can, whether it's on your Nook or iPad or Kindle. But books are really good to touch and to feel and to turn the page, I think. And I have both, but I do think it's important. And not to be afraid to say I don't know, and not to be afraid to fail. We all must fail if we're going to succeed. I don't think there's anybody who has been successful in life that can't go back and say, you know what, I learned from my mistakes, and I learned from the times I stumbled, or I learned from the times that I was challenged. And so for me, I think those are some of the key points that I would make with people. And finally, I would say to any of them who have a group of individuals that are working for them, that one of the things that I pride myself is that if your staff succeed, it is their success. If your staff fails, it is your problem. And I think that's critical to me. If something doesn't work, then I did something wrong. Not my staff did something wrong, I did something wrong. I didn't guide them appropriately. And if we were successful, then it was their work that brought the success about, because that's the only way that we succeed. So that to me is critical, something that I think I try to instill in the staff that I'm very fortunate to be able to work closely with today. Well, one of the things that I've always noticed too is, and I think we're seeing a little bit more about this happening more recently right now, but I do think that the philanthropic world in Michigan and nationwide needs to begin to look like the communities that we're serving, all right? And that's from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and it's work that the Council of Michigan Foundations is working on, and M&A is very fortunate to be part of that work. But I do think that it just can't happen. You have to work at making it happen. You need to engage young people in the field that might be running programs to expose them to the opportunities of what it is to be in the philanthropic community, to do the work that philanthropic communities do, because I think individuals may not understand that, and that's my take on it. I'm older. That's what I sense. Now, we do have a lot of young people that are in philanthropy around the country, but I also think that they're few and far between. And I think if we in Michigan are going to be attentive to what our community's needs are, then we need to have people reaching out to those communities that look like them, that understand them, that, and it's not to say that a person of a different race or color can't do that, but you know, if you're going to be in a Hispanic community, it's important to see people that are Hispanic kind of understanding your issues, because some of them may have been brought up in those same issues, okay? And I think that's that's the one thing that I'm really a little, not concerned so much because I see the work we're doing now, but I'm a little anxious because I want it to happen right away, and it's not something that happens overnight. But I think we do need to be deliberate. Our community foundations, which is where the first step could be, need to look at themselves and say, how do I engage individuals that are different than who we have right now? And how do I engage young people in my youth advisory councils that don't all look the same or come from the same economic background? I need to bring more individuals with different thoughts and different upbringings. I think that will enrich the Michigan philanthropy and enrich the work that we'll be able to do in our communities moving forward.